As far as Lee Kuan Yew is going, I just realized I'd made a mistake when he died. I'm going to commission a bust of Lee Kuan Yew and stick it somewhere important. That is the most important governmental leader. It's the most important nation builder that ever existed in the history of the world. There is no other record equal to Lee Kuan Yew's. Unbelievable achievement. A malarial swamp turned into a modern civilized powerhouse, and then using that example to utterly change and transform China. And not only China, but Vietnam. It was the example of Lee Kuan Yew that the North Koreans, of all people, turned to turn Vietnam into a powerhouse that's civilizing. There's never been a career like Lee Kuan Yew's. He did two things that strike me, it demonstrate how smart he was. There was one person in Lee Kuan Yew's high school that was smarter than he was.
His wife.
And it was a female 1 year older, so he married her. And of course his son is, all the children are successful, and the son is the Prime Minister of Singapore. Yeah, this guy just is very rational. And other people went for the lady with the most curvaceous whatever. He hired the one that got higher grades than he did, and she was the only one who did. And he had this practical judgment. Peter Kaufman loves the story of when he came to power. He's surrounded by Muslims who hate him. He has no assets, no army, no nothing. He's in a dangerous position. He realizes that in his new nation, he has to have an army. And he asks the world to help him create an army, a defense system. Everybody in the world declines. After all, it's a malarial swamp. And one country says, we'll help you. And it was Israel. He said, how can I have Israel help me when the Muslims hate Israel and I'm surrounded by Muslims who hate me? He solved his problem. He accepted help from the Israelis, and he told everybody they were Mexicans. Anyway, there's never been anything like it. And it's been a privilege to live in the same world with a man who accomplishes so much and has used so much discipline and intelligence and decency. He totally eliminated bribery. When he went on his anti-corruption kick, one of the first person that succumbed was, it wasn't his best friend, it was almost his best friend. And when the guy committed suicide, the wife came to him, who was also a friend, and said, Chinese culture, committing suicide is a loss of face for the family. Can we cover the suicide up? He said, I cannot help you in any way. This guy was very tough about getting done what had to be done. Singapore was a very corrupt place. And if his example causes China to clean up, which looks to me like it's a better than 50% bet, it'll be one more unbelievable example of the achievements of probably the most admirable man, judging by consequences, of any with whom I've shared the planet. So I'm glad you mentioned him. How are you smart enough to know how good Lee Kuan Yew was? What's your background?
I just read about you all the time, that's all.
Well, I've got an echo. They have some of the merit of Singapore in modern China. They copied it on purpose. And I regard what happened in Singapore as the best example of successful governance in the history of the world. My favorite political system in terms of being adapted to its particular circumstances successfully is Singapore. I think Singapore is the single most successful governmental system that exists in the world. They've taken a small swamp from no to a very creditable place. They're doing the Lord's work in a number of very important ways. I'm sorry they're bringing in derivatives trading. Even heaven makes mistakes. But that doesn't mean I want Singapore tomorrow in the United States. But I think Singapore's habit of stepping hard on things that will grow like cancer is the correct way to govern. And in America, we tend to wait till they're unfixable, and then we want to fix them. How well are you going to... If you won't attack a problem while it's solvable and wait till it's unfixable, you can argue that you're so damn foolish that you deserve the problem. And we have a system that is pretty irresponsible in many ways. What China adopted from Singapore was not its total management system. It adopted its system of economic management of business. It had private ownership of business and so forth. And before that, the Chinese government had owned practically everything. And Li Lu never felt that his exact Singaporean system with its democracy would necessarily be the right place for China immediately. It may well be that some other model will work better for a place as big and as backward as China was. And it may well be that the system of the Chinese lucked into by accident when they took part of what was done in Singapore. It may have been about right for China. China's weird combination of authoritarianism and free enterprise has worked wonders for the economic output of China. And Lee Kuan Yew's example had a lot to do with it. But he didn't think necessarily that what was right for a small city-state was right for a whole backward country of a different nation. But I think almost everybody with any sense in China admires Lee Kuan Yew. It's hard to think of a person of a Chinese, what would you call it, racial identity, country identity. It's hard to think of anybody who has a more credible record than Lee Kuan Yew in the history of the world. He's hugely admired in China and deserves to be. And of course, people are proud of him,
yeah,
which
sure.
they should be.
Yeah, sure, but it's like maybe...
But nobody thinks that just his exact solution. But I do think the anti-corruption part of China, that was right out of Lee Kuan Yew's book.
But I think if you think about this, if talk about one party plus the legal system, it might be the case in Singapore. If you think about like more than one party plus the legal system, that could be the case in Hong Kong, right? And Hong Kong, no corruption in the government official too.
There's no question about the fact that Hong Kong has been hugely successful. But China had a lot of corruption while it increased its GDP at 8 or 9, 10% per annum for decades. They weren't perfect, but it was a lot of achievement from where they started. The whole thing is just very, very interesting, but what's really interesting is how much influence on this outcome one human being had. And he started as a leftist labor leader. Perfectly amazing. I wish it could happen more often. You take Singapore. A terrible malaria problem. It's a swamp. He drains the swamps. He does not care if some little fish dies. No. He has a drug problem. He searches the world over for the right solution to the drug problem. He finds it in the United States. Isn't that an interesting thing? Imagine somebody in Singapore reading books and deciding the United States was the answer to Singapore's problem. He copied the military's drug bottle policy. That anybody in Singapore will pee in a bottle instantly on demand, and if they flunk, they go immediately to a tough compulsory rehab. Away went the drug problem. Just time after time after time, he made these winning decisions. He wanted the place to be prosperous. He figured out who he wanted to come in, and he made the civilization very user-friendly to what he wanted to attract. And it worked. then it's 70% Chinese and 30% Malay. And every Chinese thinks that the Chinese are superior to the Malays. And he thinks that's terribly counterproductive if anybody should ever say so. So he passes a law. You can't say if you're Chinese in Singapore that you think there's any superiority in the Chinese. I think that's a very sensible law for Singapore to have. But of course it has some infringement of free speech. But anyway, just time after time after time, he's done this thing. His approach to marriage was interesting. The average very successful man in the Asian culture marries an exceptionally good-looking woman who's somewhat dumber than he is. This is the system. Well, this guy was so smart that he was the second-ranked school student in his high school. And the student that was 1/10 of a percentage point higher was female. So he didn't follow the Asian rule of hiring the beautiful woman with the big boobs, who's a little dumber than you are. He married this woman that was 1/10 of a point higher. And who is now the Prime Minister of Singapore? Their son. I mean, this is a very unusually successful man. It's a very unusually successful history. So while I can't answer your question, if you will make a study of the life and work of Lee Kuan Yew, you will find one of the most interesting and instructive political stories written in the history of mankind. This is better than Athens, this is an unbelievable history. And you will learn a lot that will be useful in your own life. So my answer to you is, don't ask Charlie Munger. Study the life and work of Lee Kuan Yew. You're going to be flabbergasted.